Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the very first ever Bayou Blue Democrats online meeting via Zoom. We want to thank you all for being here. We want to also wish everybody well during this very strange and stressful time. And we want to, of course, our thoughts and prayers are with those who are suffering or who have potentially even lost a loved one during this time. Before we get started, I'd like to just cover a few logistical items. The first is everyone's microphone is muted and your video is off. This is just to ensure we don't have any background noise or anything like that. We also have disabled the chat in order to minimize any distraction while the speakers are going. However, we do want to let you know, we do encourage questions. So you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box. You can send in your questions. And as soon as Professor Stein has completed talking, I will be asking him those questions in the order we get them in. So please don't hesitate to send in any questions. And without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, someone who we all know, Professor Bob Stein. He's a professor at Rice University in political science department, has held many positions there, including Dean of Social Sciences previously. Of course, more personally, he's a mentor of mine. We've gotten to know each other very well as someone who has always been providing very, very great advice on all things politics and life. So today, he'll be discussing politics, coronavirus, and all of the above. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Bob Stein.
Thank you, Raj. Let me tell you what I like to talk about, and then I'll happy to entertain any questions. Can you all see that? Essentially, what I want to talk about is making, let me get this to a point where I can do a slideshow, is making voting, I'm going to move this just to give me a sec, making voting safe for voters and poll workers. If you want to read this, I will be happy, email this to Raj and you can post it. But at the bottom here, you'll see I wrote a co-authored with my colleagues Barry Burden at the University of Wisconsin and Charles Stewart at the MIT, a piece that was in the Washington Post on the monkey cage. We've been, the three of us and many of our other colleagues have been doing a lot of work over the last decade since the 2000 election on working with local election officials on how to make voting more convenient, how to increase turnout, how to increase voter ballot completion. And this is the culmination, this particular piece that we wrote in the Post is a culmination of that. You probably have heard just today, Michael Wynn, who is the election administrator for Harris County, testified in a lawsuit brought by the Democratic Party of Texas to push and extend mail-in voting. As you all know, Texas has a more restrictive form of mail-in voting limited to people over 65, other able and people out of the jurisdiction. What I'd like to talk about is basically how to make voting in 2020. And remember, it's not just the November election, but it's the election coming up in July, the runoff for the primary. Barry is a University of Wisconsin professor and was intimately involved in the machinations just before and still ongoing in Wisconsin. So some of this draws on that. I'll be happy to talk about anything else, but this not only has preoccupied my time, but I should point out, I'll mention this later on, we're implementing some of these things right now here in Harris County. We're undertaking a survey of election poll workers, as well as a sample of election of voters about how they feel about voting in an election where we may still be under some threat from the coronavirus, if not as strong a threat as we have now. Let me tell you what I think.
Professor Stein, just one thing. I think we're seeing not slides, they're not projected fully. We're seeing the next slide also. So is there a way to project fully, maybe
Let me
display
fix that up. Hold it on. Hold up.
There we are. There we go. We got it now. We got it now.
So let me go back. Basically, the challenge is to prevent and protect voters and poll workers from contracting. And the way to think about this is that there are steps in the voting process at which voters and poll workers are both and separately vulnerable to both contracting and spreading the virus. And that's checking in the vote, checking to vote, which is you queue up in these long lines outside. And there the threat is between voters. Then you go inside a building and check in with a poll worker, another opportunity now for the voter and the poll worker. And then there's a whole idea of you marking a ballot or a DRE, scanning your paper ballot, depositing the paper ballot for counting. The bottom line is this anecdote or aphorism that I have below. You can hold an election without many voters, but you can't conduct an election, and I apologize, without many poll workers. You can have a low turnout or a high turnout, but if you don't have an adequate number of poll workers, you just don't have an election. People don't get processed, people walk out of line, ballots don't get counted in a timely way. And so what I'm suggesting here is that the solution to whatever threat the coronavirus might present suggests that there's no one means of meeting that challenge. Where, when, and how voters cast their ballots on and before Election Day varies across our 50 states. More importantly, it isn't the states that run elections. It's the 3,000 plus jurisdictions, mostly counties like Harris and Travis, They're the ones that run the election. Voting by mail has been touted as a means of lessening this risk. And clearly, if we all got mailed a ballot, we wouldn't eliminate the risk because somebody has to, of course, open those envelopes, count those ballots, and process them. But we can at least reduce it to a smaller number of people who are willing to do this kind of work, poll workers. But the bigger problem is that mail balloting has legal, political, and very practical challenges. And within jurisdiction solutions must probably include some in-person voting. That is to say, we can't replace between now and November 2020 all in-person voting, whether it's early or on election day. And in fact, I'm going to show you why that's almost impossible. Consider this. This is how we vote in this country. The vast majority, close to 2/3, vote on election day and do so in person. Only about a quarter, and I'll show you that number is greatly inflated, but only about a quarter of Americans vote by mail. And less than a quarter, 17%, do what we have in Texas, in-person early voting, some number of days before election day. Voting by mail comes in a lot of forms and a lot of varieties. 5 states, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and Utah, they mail every voter who's registered a ballot before every election. California is moving in that direction. Colorado, Oregon, and Washington have been doing it the longest. Hawaii, no, Utah came into this just in the 2018 election. 33 states and the District of Columbia allow no excuse absentee mail-in voting, which means that anybody can request for any reason a ballot be mailed to them. 13 states, including our own, Texas, limit absentee mail-in voting to certain persons, mostly people who are over 65. The share of vote cast by mail, the one I showed you before, the 25%, is deceiving, lumpy, and greatly exaggerated. In only 7 states, 9 states in 2018, did a majority of voters submit ballots by mail, not in person. In most states, fewer than 10% cast their ballots by mail. That means that for most states, suddenly doubling or tripling their mail-in balloting would be expensive and require significant planning and really new logistic systems. To give you a better picture of that, and maybe this map doesn't show it as well, here is Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. They're all mail. But the proportion that's under 24% is well over, starting in Maine, going all the way across. Western states tend to have more mail-in voting. If somebody wants to know why, I'll explain it later. But the vast majority of Americans don't have that opportunity. if you want to get an idea, this, and I hope the table's a little bit small, but the average share of vote cast by mail in the 7 states that were over 50% is close to 80%. But in the remaining 43 states, it's only 11%. So what do we have to do to get that 11% to 30%? That's a 3-fold increase. Well, there's a lot to do. In most states, a voter must request an absentee ballot. A ballot's mailed to the voter who fills it out and returns it by mail or in person before or on election day. Once delivered to the local election office, a ballot has to be opened. The signature on the ballot, if there's a signature, has to be verified and then counted. So for states that haven't done this, like Texas, did I mention what the share of vote cast in Texas was? I'm going to just go back to the last. I don't think Texas is on this one, but it's somewhere around 6%. Way down here, which means that you're going from a rather trivial number of ballots mailed in our county. We're talking 6% of, let's say, 1 million ballots. It's not a lot. But if you make it 30%, you've gone up to about 300,000. There are just not enough voting machines, enough personnel, enough letter openers. Think about what you have to do to run a mail-in election. You got to get envelopes. You got to get ballots, and ballots appropriate for everybody in their own jurisdiction. There's a lot to do. Let me tell you what else happens with mail-in voting. The advantages: it's safer for the voter during the coronavirus. It minimizes poll worker contact. What's real interesting is mail ballots have a higher rate of ballot completion. Why is that important? We're getting rid of straight ticket voting. Many of our voters spend 3.5 minutes voting when they walk into the voting booth. There are long lines. They may not want to spend time. So mail ballots do have a positive effect because you get that ballot well before election day and can take 2 or 3 days to fill it out. You might not know the judges, but you can pick up your cell phone and do that. Find out. You can ask somebody. I should note here, there are no, of course, mail-in elections really drop your costs dramatically. You don't have to rent local schools. You don't have to pay poll workers. There's no evidence of partisan advantage. I want to make this very clear. To date, no research has shown that Democrats or Republicans are advantaged by mail-in voting. And I said positive turnout and ballot completion. But let me tell you about the problems with vote by mail. It's estimated that in 2008, almost 4 million requested ballots were never received. How could that be? Well, in jurisdictions that don't have a lot of vote by mail, or like Colorado and Washington, the address you have on the voter list might not match up with the United States Postal Service universal address file. You might write down 2115 Rutland and forget to put North Rutland. Well, Rutland's good enough because the election official can figure out where you live and the precinct you're in and can get you the right ballot. Your address is mostly used by the election officers to get you the right ballot, not to mail you a ballot. But if you don't have a properly cured, properly adjusted voter list with the right mailing addresses, many people. There were over 60,000 ballots in Wisconsin never delivered. 2.9 ballots were mailed to voters and never returned. 800,000 ballots in 2008 were rejected. Why? Because people forgot to sign their ballot. And in many instances, the signatures didn't match up because people's signatures on the voter list were the original signatures they made when they first registered to vote. And as we all know, our signature changes over time. People who vote by mail are significantly more likely to make mistakes than persons who vote in person. Many people who vote by mail for the first time not only make mistakes, under and over vote, they hit the wrong or mark the wrong box, but many people fail to properly sign. They just forget to do that. So be careful what you wish for. Ramping up for this requires not only that the voters are fully informed and capable of participating in a form of voting they've not used before, but that the election officials and election officers have the resources and time. In states which have vote by mail, even though ballots are mailed in Oregon, Washington, Colorado, 2/3 of those ballots that are mailed to voters are returned in person 2 days or later or sooner to election day. It means that the county election officials that count those ballots have to have a great organization and a large number of people and scanning machines and bipartisan committees to review and verify signatures. Again, it's taken states like Colorado, Washington, and Oregon several years to get up to speed, curing the voter list, educating the voters about filling out their ballots properly and signing them, getting voters to return their ballots a few more days before election day so that election officials can open, verify, and count and report the election results on election night, rather than what happened in Wisconsin. It took them a full week to do all of that. Curing the challenges with mail voting is just hard. Here are the ones I just mentioned: identifying qualified vendors to print your ballots in envelopes, partnering with the Postal Service to deliver the ballots, developing a tracking system so voters know where their ballots are in the delivery stream, knowing that their ballot has been received. And they have to find ways to review signatures and count ballots to reduce the number of rejected ballots. Michael Wynn, who's the Harris County election administrator, is a strong supporter of vote by mail, but he said, I can't gear up for that. I can't have over half the ballots cast by mail and expect to be ready to process them or even to meet all those demands. So what are we left with? We're left with expanded limitations on who can vote by mail to include possibly more eligible voters. One idea, because remember, changing laws in red states with blue oases, not going to be easy. One of the ways I think we can probably change vote by mail is drop the age requirement from 65 to 50. Why do I suggest that? Well, if you look at the voter file for the state of Texas and you look at who votes Republican and Democratic, you find that between the ages of 50 and even 55 and 64, there are far more Republican voters than there are Democratic voters. Republican voters are older and, of course, decidedly Anglo. And here's the other thing: they're much more likely to vote by mail. Does this mail voting increase turnout? No, they'd vote anyway. But in the coronavirus environment, I could imagine a compromise between the Democrats and the Republicans would be to just drop that age and maybe allow individuals who have legitimate health risks from the coronavirus, not just, of course, people over 50, but people who have immunotherapy, undergoing cancer treatments, high risk in diabetes, and of course, coronary and hypertension. We don't in this state ask for a letter from your doctor to prove that you're other able, although you can be prosecuted almost always by the local jurisdiction. So those are the two practical suggestions I'd make. Drop the age, change the requirements on health to include legitimate concerns from the coronavirus. If you encourage all voters to use mail ballots in states with no excuse mail-in, you might want to allow also online ballot requests and establish what we call remote or secure locations for dropping off the ballot. In Colorado and Oregon, they have what you might call supersized mailboxes, but they're secure. They have cameras, locks, and they're, of course, cleaned of their ballots every night. This would allow voters to drop their ballots off and not worry about whether the Postal Service is going to be able to deliver them. There are a lot of ways we can make in-person voting safe, because the fact of the matter is, in Texas, in November, as probably well as July, more than half and probably close to 60%, if not more, of our votes will be cast in person on or before Election Day. Luckily, we have early voting. So if you think of voting as a social distance problem, if you extend the number of days, number of hours, number of locations, and within locations increase the square footage, You can do what we do with the coronavirus, reduce the curve and spread it out, widen the distance and time that people vote. We could do outdoor polling locations, a polling location where voters are separated from poll workers by plexiglass. So instead of handing somebody your voter ID, you hold it up, don't touch the screen, use a scanner to read the universal barcode. And so you have a scanner, you hold your driver's license up, it gets scanned, nobody is touching anything. Periodically, because people will touch the plexiglass, we will wipe it down and disinfect it. Polling locations can also, and this is things that have been tested, I'll tell you, Wisconsin did them recently, give people Q-tips or sanitized gloves to use on the e-slate. Instead of electronic touch screens or paper ballots, we have the e-slate. Wisconsin also has been using the e-slate, and they had oversized Q-tips and handed people sanitized gloves. A polling location where access to the voting machines might be staggered by something as simple as alphabetical order of the last name. Some of you are old enough, Raj is not, to remember the 1974 oil embargo, where people could only buy gas on even days corresponding to the last digit on their license plates. I think that we could use in some urban areas, Houston could be one, you go into the Macy's and instead of, you go to the third floor if you have A through B and the fourth floor. And again, you've got large spaces spread out and you go to the men's wear to vote. You go to the women's wear to vote. They do this in Argentina and it works very well. A polling location where only one person can vote at a time. If we have enough days, hours, and locations, we can really limit voting to one person per kiosk. It will be slow. How about drive-through polling? We do that for those who are handicapped. It's possible. We did it. They did it in Wisconsin. People drove up. They were handed a machine by a PPE decked out poll worker who then handed that machine to somebody else. And it was wiped down and used again. A polling location can have distancing requirements as well. There are a lot of creative ways in which we can make in-person voting work. I'm almost done. A couple of other ones I've mentioned here: early voting, election day vote centers, which means just getting large, very large, big box. Don't hold it at a neighborhood elementary school with 2 machines. Hold it at a Walmart, a hotel on I-10, and extend the days and hours. I'm going to stop here and be happy to answer any questions. Let me get the other thing to remember is if you get embroiled in political battles, legal challenges, you're just delaying the time that election officials have to prepare. As I said before, I'm about to go into the field with 2 surveys, and the information that we get from the poll workers is extremely important so that we can make plans, the county, to locate, staff, and operate both early election day and even mail-in voting. I'll be happy to answer any questions either about Wisconsin or the primaries. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, this is perfect. Thank you, Dr. Stein. And again, remember, if you have questions, feel free to put them directly into the Q&As. So the first question we have, Professor Stein, is from one of our members who says, can local jurisdictions drop the age or allow no excuse vote by mail, or does the state have the power on this?
No, Texas is one of 36 states that gives emergency powers to its governor in a variety of settings, including elections. But the answer is no. Local election officials have some wide discretion, and this, of course, is about to be litigated. Several years ago, Attorney General Paxson was asked to rule on the question of what constitutes a legitimate excuse, medical excuse. It turned out that voters in the spring primary elections and school bond elections didn't want to vote in person because of hay fever or the allergy seasons. At the time, the Attorney General rendered a decision that was rather liberal and gave the local official, in this case, the county clerk, a lot of discretion. He has since backtracked on that, but it is solely an authority that is given to the Secretary of State and the Attorney General who can rule on that. The governor, however, does have executive authority. He can, in this state, rule, because of the coronavirus and because of what he will call a state emergency, relax certain requirements, including the number of days and hours and locations. We passed a law, if you recall, regarding early voting that now requires that if you do have early voting, you have to have it on the same number of days and the same number of hours at every location. That was the way the Republicans could cut back, because many jurisdictions were varying the hours and days of early voting at certain locations, such as on the weekends, not having it at, let's say, a college or community college where nobody's attending. These are the kinds of things that the governor can relax. I think that the Republicans, like the Democrats, have, how can I say this, overreached on their opposition or support for all mail. And I think there's an obvious compromise here. And that's assuming that voters still feel threatened. It doesn't matter whether the coronavirus is or is not a threat to us. What matters is how voters perceive it and how they adjust their behavior. And I think there are as many Republican voters who are concerned about the coronavirus as are Democrats. I didn't notice the virus having a blue or red preference.
Right. We have a question around security and issues around fear of, can this be hacked? Can we make sure that voting by mail is secure? I know you talked a little bit about this, Mr. Stein. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on the security piece.
Well, I mean, the vote by mail, where everybody's mailed the ballot, has been perfected in the 3 states that I've mentioned, but it's taken a while. And I myself would never recommend the state of Texas attempt to mail every registered voter a ballot. I would strongly oppose that. Why? It simply can't get done. We would disenfranchise far more voters, probably disproportionately younger, people of color, people that move around. If we use absentee mail-in ballots, there is this charge that the president's made. I have not yet heard it from any state official that it's subject to fraud. Let me say that there are opportunities in which mail ballots can be intercepted through mailboxes, not unlike a Social Security check. But there are ways to assure and legitimize that ballot, one of which, of course, is the matching of the signature. Nevertheless, I think, this is, should we increase the share of vote cast by mail? There will inevitably, I don't think, be fraud. I think there will be just lots of errors, lots of ballots that won't get delivered, lots of ballots that won't be returned, more ballots that will not be counted because they're not properly signed or signed at all. The signature doesn't match. There is no signature. In states like Colorado, when somebody fails to sign their ballot, guess what? The election official calls them up, because in addition to their address, they have information provided by the voter so they can be contacted to what we call cure their deficient ballot, like not signing it, not using the right signature, or not voting or undervoting, or not making it possible. And they can do that in a matter of hours by emailing or faxing somebody a ballot. For those who are worried about the legitimacy of this, how do you think the military vote? The UNICAVA, the Universal Overseas Ballot, which are military, overseas military, and many military personnel who are stationed outside of their home jurisdiction, all vote by mail. They get their ballots by internet, and they can return them by fax or by the internet. So this is not something we haven't been doing. My suspicions are fraud is the least of the problems. It's simply going to be very hard to administer vote by mail in states that have not prepared for nor had a lot of experience. Fraud probably is the least of the concerns I would have.
We have a follow-up question about online voting. Is that something that could happen? The questioner says, I can move large amounts of money online, but cannot vote online. This makes no sense.
Well, there are states that have had elections online, only primary elections, and those are partisan primary elections. Arizona has experimented with it in 2016 and again in 2018. But to my knowledge, no one holds online elections except the military, because they get to take their ballots, fill them out, have them digitized, and sent back via the internet, and in a secured way. I mean, believe me, the Election Assistance Commission, which is the body that collects a lot of this data, has shown that UNICAVA ballots from overseas expats and mostly military personnel, diplomatic sources, almost always electronically I think there are some problems, and yes, they can be hacked. My colleague Dan Wallach, with whom I collaborate, would be more expert on that, but I don't think we're going to be seeing it anytime soon.
A couple more process questions, then we'll go to more electoral questions. So the next process question is, are there plans to prevent a shortage of voting booths in African-American neighborhoods? I think we could expand that to low-income neighborhoods, as happened in the primary, due to the decision to give equal number of booths to Republicans who do not need it.
Yeah, I did a lot of research for the county clerk on that, and my conclusion was it was an unfortunate decision that was largely driven by a concern on the part of the clerk to be fair and give an equal number of voting machines both to the Democratic and the Republican boxes. You should know that this is the first election in which the parties agreed to locate their polling locations at the same site, but not cooperate. So all polling places had a Democratic and a Republican polling booth, and they had an equal number of machines. But it did not for voters because the Republicans did not turn out. They turned out a third fewer voters. What I have found was that the biggest problem was mostly in African American communities, where voters moved decidedly from voting in person early to election day. I attribute that to the decision of many African American voters to wait and see the results of the South Carolina primary. And because of that, we had a flip. Usually we get about a 55% vote cast early and about a 45, sometimes as low as 40, somewhere between 40 and 45% cast on election day. That flipped. And because of that, and the decision that I think was probably a poor decision, but I think the clerk would have been criticized by the Republicans had she given them fewer voting machines. I don't think she will repeat that mistake come July 15th. I think she will recognize that. And I don't think she could have anticipated what happened, because I think nobody thought that Joe Biden would do as well as he did coming out of the South Carolina primary. And of course, when he got to Texas on the Super Tuesday, he all but, I think, swept the primaries. But he did because largely African American voters in our county and in our city simply waited to see what their voters or Democratic voters did in South Carolina. I did not notice the problem and the shift to election day voting. There were no lines in African American early voting locations. The lines only occurred in about a dozen to 15 boxes on election day. TSU being, notorious, and was on the news. And the students simply, I think, I can't tell you I polled on this. I didn't. But anecdotally, my colleagues at Channel 11 I asked them to ask some of the students, why did they wait to vote on election day? And to a person, there were only 5 or 6, said, we wanted to see how Biden did in South Carolina and Sanders. I think many younger voters were torn between voting for Sanders versus Biden, and they were looking for a cue.
All right, now let's go to some political questions, and we'll come back to process questions. So first political question. I'm interested in the March primary results. Any major observations you can share, Professor Stein, on the March primary? Presumably Democrat side, I guess, more so.
There are two things. I spent a lot of time looking at how the election was conducted. So to the previous questioner, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why people voted early on election day and voted on. I was particularly interested with the vote centers, why there was a shift. Were people voting on election day? Now they could vote anywhere. I was particularly interested in how younger voters who now were being given opportunities to vote at TSU, Rice didn't get to vote on their campus this time. There was a big controversy over that. The Democrats and Republicans wanted to locate elsewhere. But I was particularly interested in seeing what happened in 2018. So let me reprise. In 2018, we saw an enormous surge in overall turnout. The 2018 midterm looked like a presidential election. It was 53% voter turnout in the state of Texas, just about the same in Harris County. And the biggest increase in voter turnout was among people under the age of 45. Some of you might think under 45 is old, but it's young, and particularly under 25. What I was interested in seeing, would those voters come back in a Democratic primary, even in a Republican primary? Would they come back, of course, in 2020? And the answer was, yeah, they did. They came back. I was particularly surprised among non-Anglo voters under those ages of 45 and 25. I wanted to see how much they were attracted to Bernie Sanders, particularly because my sense was that Anglo young voters were much more attracted to Bernie Sanders than were voters of color. And the expectation was not confirmed. I was particularly surprised how many black boxes, particularly around TSU, and I can see where the young voters are voting, and their share of vote for the candidates, they en masse went to Biden. I don't know if that tells me that they like Biden over Bernie Sanders, or if, like many of Democratic voters, they sort of settled on this is the guy that can win. What was very clear also from polling, my colleague Mark Jones who was working with the people at U of H, Hobby Center, was the tremendous desire to pick a candidate that can win in November, even over the preference for candidates who might be strong on issues like global warming, or strong on issues like Medicaid for all, Medicare for all, or even issues dealing with DACA and immigration. It was as if the issues were less important than was the goal of electing. The other thing I was particularly interested in is how many incumbents were challenged in the Democratic primary. As we all know, 2016 was a really good year for Democrats in Harris County, and they swept and they took a lot of seats. Of course, again in 2018, with Lina Hidalgo, probably the biggest surprise winner. And the question that I rose was, when a party comes into what I call hegemony, into dominance, when the Democrats sweep like that, what happens is that the primary becomes more important than the general election, because that's where you're really choosing the next elected official. More than likely, Democrats will win a substantial majority of seats in 2020, whatever those seats may be. And so I had the idea that Democratic activists would not let incumbents get the normal bye. And I was right. And so much so that Vince Ryan loses his nomination for county attorney. Rodney Ellis was challenged. Kim Ogg was challenged. Ann Bennett was challenged. Most of these incumbents, not all, Vince Ryan lost. And the concern was that, of course, open seats, if you defeat an incumbent in a primary, you've made that an open seat, and open seats are much more likely to flip from one party to the other. So I think, for instance, yes, I do think the county attorney's race will be a little closer. I don't suggest that the Democratic nominee is weaker, but I think there's every reason to believe that Vince Ryan, as an incumbent, might have been stronger simply because of name recognition, particularly now that we don't have straight ticket voting. So that was the other thing about the primary was interesting, how many incumbents are challenged. And let me say, even in nonpartisan races, now that there is a blue control over city offices, council, mayor, and controller, what did you see with a 4-year term limit rather than the 3 2-year? You saw that people weren't going to wait 4 years, and you saw many incumbent councilmen seriously challenged. Most, sadly, in the case of our friend Raj, were reelected, but not all. And so I think, again, what you see is that the term of office, the party that has the advantage may actually start what we call intramural competition. The Republicans had this problem, we call it the Tea Party. And eventually the Republican Party swung further right under the influence not just of the Tea Party, but eventually with their presidential candidate and now president and of course presidential nominee, Donald Trump.
Great. Next question. Texas 2, Dan Crenshaw. What are your thoughts on winning that district?
You know, Crenshaw is, there are a couple of reasons why I think he is vulnerable, but not in this election. I'm not impressed with what happened. I know the primary runoff was ended with one of my former students, Cardenas, deciding not to run. But I think the bigger problem here is that we just don't have strong candidates like Wendy Davis running against Chip Roy up in the I hope I get the number right, 22nd outside of Travis County and Leander. Why? Because I don't think after 2020, when we redraw the districts in 2022, Crenshaw is going to have a seat. There's no way that Republican district can be maintained. I think Crenshaw is popular. He's almost so popular as a Republican that he's been used as a national celebrity to raise money elsewhere. And I think they'll find him a seat to protect him, but it's not going to be that seat. So no matter who ran against him, anybody who was a what I call quality Democrat. What do I mean by quality? I mean a candidate who has held elective office or currently holds elective office. If Rodney Ellis were running for that seat, if somebody like John Whitmire, state senator, then I'd say, whoa, that's a serious candidate, and he or she has a chance. There are a lot of good reasons why John Whitmire and Rodney are not running, not the least of which is they have jobs and duties they want to perfect. But they wouldn't run for that seat because they know the seat's going to be redrawn. Redistricting is going to dramatically change the landscape of Texas, with or without a good count on the census. Crenshaw, I think, is a relatively safe candidate, largely because he's drawn what I will call not the strongest opponent, and that opponent won't get a lot of money. Now, Wendy Davis, up in Travis County, that's the person running against Chip Roy. Chip Roy is a former chief of staff of our Senator Ted Cruz. I think I would not have thought Chip Roy was vulnerable. Now I think he is. I think the coronavirus has changed the dimensions and the character of some races, and that could be that could be among the best chance for a Democratic pickup, other than of course Congressman Hurd is not running again, so the seat out in El Paso, Meadows' old seat, Beto O'Rourke, is not really it'll be a flip, but there won't be an incumbent defeated. I think Chip Roy, who's only of course a first-term congressperson, has taken what I call an unusual track. He's been very critical of the relief bill. He's been very critical of the shutdown for the coronavirus. And I think he's misestimating the electorate there. It's a suburban, exurban electorate. And they're looking for government to solve their problems. And Chip Roy is more about, let's get government out of our hair. Right now, people would rather government be in their hair and scalp and probably vaccinating them as well. I don't think Fletcher's in any great danger now, but of course, a lot depends on what happens between now and November in terms of the coronavirus and how that affects campaigning. I think we're in a wholly uncharted water about how campaigns are conducted. That's why I spent so much time talking about vote by mail. I mean, it's possible we'll have therapeutic treatments. It's possible that the herd notion that there are a lot more people who have tested positive for the antibodies and that people like me are safe from having to get out there in the public. Somewhere between that hopeful outcome and the current situation probably rests where we'll be. But it's only 200 days or less before the presidential election. That's just not a lot of time. I don't think, the president wants to open up things on May 1st. Governor Cuomo is talking, maybe June 1st or end of May. Let's say somewhere in between. We're looking at probably the second week in May, Memorial Day. That leaves June, July, August, September, part of October. It's hard to say how campaigns can be conducted. How many people will feel comfortable going out to rallies? As I've said before, I think we're just in uncharted territory. But I don't underestimate what happened in Wisconsin as being something that's generalized. And I don't mean the fact that they coped with mail-in voting. They had a 30% drop in turnout between 2016 and 2020, 30% fewer Democratic voters. Yes, Republicans didn't have much to vote for, although that state Supreme Court race was extremely important. I think the story of Wisconsin isn't about the coronavirus, Republicans preventing all voters to vote by mail. I think the story is Democrats came out and voted and defeated a Republican incumbent state Supreme Court judge by margins of over 120,000 votes. That state has been through more elections than I have fingers and toes on my body in the last 5 years. They've had 2 recall elections for governor, plus a gubernatorial election. They've had, of course, 2 Senate elections. They've had other judicial and, of course, legislative races, and everything has been by the smallest margins. This is the widest margin of any election, probably since 2012, when, of course, Obama beat Romney in that state. I think Democrats are, in states like Wisconsin, coming back. And if they're coming back in Wisconsin, you can be certain that you're going to see that pattern in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and I think the one that I think is going to now look very strong for Democrats is Florida. And again, it's about voters not just turning out, but what I've talked, I'm sure some of you have heard me before, the demographic change, voters leaving the electorate and aging out. It's a fancy word for dying. New voters coming in and voting at rates they've never voted before. Yeah, there are a lot of young people that are eligible to vote, but they just never voted. And we were waiting to see if 218 was a fluke. I think we got a little bit of a glimmer here. Don't get too excited, but a glimmer that what happened in Wisconsin, in spite of enormously lower turnout, was that Democratic voters were highly motivated. Now, they may have been motivated by the efforts of the Republicans to suppress them. I think they were motivated long before the Republicans tried to suppress the mail-in voting. I think they were motivated by the actions of the president.
Just a couple more here. So you sort of already touched on the presidential race. Thoughts on Cornyn and the Senate race?
You know, we have a primary runoff in July. I just don't think that Cornyn, again, that without straight ticket voting, I think that there are many more Democrats who feel comfortable with Cornyn. My money would be on Hagar. Maybe State Senator West may surprise us with a higher turnout in the Dallas area, but I don't see either of those 2 candidates being extremely strong. The only way that I think you beat Cornyn at this point is a tremendous, what I will call, failure of the Republican brand. And that would have to be, God forbid, an epidemic, a national economic recession of such proportions that you got the kind of 1932 repudiation of Herbert Hoover, of the president. I think Cornyn's probably among the few Republican statewide candidates who is, if not respected, has more support than among Democrats than anyone else, whether it be Abbott or Paxton or Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. Now, I don't think that race, I mean, here's the thing. There's a woman, she's a former student too, Annie Mama, I forgot her last name, Hispanic surname. She finished 4th. She finished ahead of Chris Bell and Amanda Edwards. So I don't know what that tells me, but Garcia, Annie Mama Garcia. And this wasn't a strong field. And good candidates who've run for office, hold office, raise money, they run for office and higher office. When they don't run, that tells me a lot. It tells me that the incumbent's hard to beat. I am much more bullish about the Democrats picking up state house seats. I think as we've talked about this before, I think that's where I am much more bullish. I think the Dems have a chance to close that 9-seat gap, and maybe they don't get all 9, but they get enough so that the Republican Party, which is terribly wounded by, of course, all the scandals with the Speaker, Bonin, and I think going into 2020, the state's finances are just in total shambles, not just because of the coronavirus, but because of the tremendous drop in oil and gas revenues. And the governor might have to call a special session just to close that gap. Should he have to do that, it'll be interesting to see how well the Republican caucus can stay together, particularly in the House side, particularly on issues of caps on spending and revenues for schools and cities. It's one thing to have the caps during a good economy. It's another when you can't pay your bills, and the city is at the point where when you rely on sales tax for 40 to maybe 50% of your revenues, you just can't open up the city without raising property taxes. And of course, the cap is there. And the question becomes, at what point does the state give in and say, you know what, we'll help you out?
One final question. Is there any movement toward ranked choice voting? Could that be implemented by the county, or more or less difficult than voting by mail?
It's a little less difficult by voting by mail because for municipal governments, home rule charters give them a wide latitude for how they conduct their elections. But most would require some type of, if you wanted to move out of that into state legislative offices, county offices, which are state controlled, you would have to have statutory approval. Funny you should mention, but I just sat on a dissertation prospectus with one of my students who's doing a study of rank order voting. I'm not myself convinced the argument of rank order voting is a better expression of true preferences, and of course reduces the need to hold primary runoffs or any runoff, because you're of course we sometimes call these instant primaries or instant runoffs. But time doesn't permit me to go into all the pluses and minuses. Not likely to happen anytime real soon, but I'd watch for it on the horizon. And yeah, depending on the state. Our state constitution doesn't. It's not an easy thing to implement here, but in Maine they did it, and New Hampshire, so it's not impossible. And they did it for federal elections.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stein, for this conversation, for the Q&A. I know we actually can't have applause, so I'll just applaud for everybody because they're not able to. But thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Stein. If there's anything final words you want to add before we close?
I'll send you the PowerPoint and with the link if anybody wants to read more on it. Thank you for taking the evening out to hear me. And
absolutely.
You all have a good week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this meeting. And we want to thank you for coming to our very first Zoom online meeting. To learn more about the club, feel free to visit www.bayoubluedemocrats.com or our Facebook page. And if you're not a member or you'd like to become a member or you haven't renewed, feel free to go to the website or to the Act Blue page. Thank you again. We'll be following up with emails soon. And we hope you enjoyed this meeting and more meetings coming soon. Stay safe. Thank you so much and have a great evening.